The train hissed like a wounded animal as it slowed to a stop at the edge of the prairie, and Eleanor Whitlock stepped down onto the wooden platform with a single valise in her hand and a heart full of fragile hope she refused to name aloud, because hope had betrayed her too many times before, yet here she was anyway, answering an advertisement printed in small ink in a distant newspaper, promising marriage, stability, and a place to belong. And she had crossed 3 states chasing those promises, each mile telling her she was foolish and brave in equal measure, the wind biting through her thin coat as if to test her resolve. The town little more than a scattering of buildings and dust, nothing like the life she had imagined, but everything like the last chance she had left. And when the rancher came for her, tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved from years of sun and silence, she saw not warmth but something harder, something guarded, as though he had already decided she would disappoint him, and perhaps she would, because disappointment was the one thing she had always been good at delivering without trying, yet she smiled anyway, because that was what women like her were taught to do when standing on the edge of someone else's expectations. He introduced himself as Caleb Harlan, his voice low and restrained, his eyes never quite meeting hers. And on the long ride to the ranch, the wagon wheels creaking in rhythm with her thoughts, she learned that he had lost his first wife to illness, that the land had nearly swallowed him whole afterward, and that neighbors had urged him to find a woman through practical means rather than romantic ones. And she understood then that she was not a dream come true, but a solution to a problem, a transaction wrapped in lace and letters. And still, she told herself, solutions could grow into something more if given time and care, just as barren soil could bloom if someone believed in it enough to try. The ranch house stood lonely against the horizon, strong but unwelcoming, and when she stepped inside, the air felt heavy, with memories that were not hers, and grief that had never been allowed to soften, and she sensed immediately that she was walking into a life that did not want her yet, perhaps never would. But she unpacked her few belongings anyway, folding dresses with careful hands, pretending this was temporary discomfort and not the beginning of something deeply uncertain. Dinner passed in strained politeness, words exchanged like obligations rather than conversation, and when she reached for his hand by accident, the briefest brush of skin sent him pulling away as if burned, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with something she could not yet name. And later that night, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and wondered how many nights it took for loneliness to become unbearable, how many rejections one heart could survive before it simply stopped trying. And she almost laughed at the irony that she had crossed half a country to marry a man who looked at her like a stranger. He was forced to tolerate. Days passed, each one teaching her the unspoken rules of the ranch, where to walk, when to speak, when to stay silent, and she worked hard, harder than she had ever worked before, because usefulness felt like the closest thing to safety, and the townsfolk watched her with curious eyes, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all of them aware that mail-order brides rarely found fairy tales, and when whispers reached her ears that Caleb had never wanted another wife, only a housekeeper with a ring to keep gossip at bay. Something inside her cracked but did not break, because breaking would mean admitting defeat, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never beg for love again. The tension finally snapped one evening after a small mistake, a meal overcooked, a comment misunderstood, and Caleb's voice rose in frustration, not cruel but cold. Final, and in that moment Eleanor understood with devastating clarity that she was an intrusion in a life, carefully built around solitude. Not a partner, not a comfort, just a reminder of loss he had never healed from. And she retreated to her room, packed her valise with shaking hands, tears blurring her vision as the weight of rejection pressed down on her chest until breathing felt like work. And before dawn, she left a note on the table written in steady ink despite the storm inside her, the words simple and dignified. "I'll leave at dawn," because she would not make a spectacle of her pain, would not demand an apology that could not be given honestly, and as she reached for the door, believing the house still slept and that she could slip away unnoticed, the lock turned with a sharp sound that stopped her cold, and Caleb stood there blocking the exit, his face unreadable but his voice firm as he said, "You're not leaving, not alone." If this story stirred something in you, the ache of resilience, the quiet strength of starting over, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this only grow stronger when shared with those who believe in second chances. Caleb's hand remained on the door long after the echo of his words faded into the quiet house. The dim blue light of pre-dawn, slipping through the window panes and casting shadows that made Eleanor feel as though she stood between two worlds. One she was desperate to leave behind, and one she had never truly entered. And when she looked up at him, she expected anger or pity or even indifference. But instead she saw something far more unsettling, a conflict he had spent years burying beneath routine and silence. And it unnerved her because it meant this was no longer just her pain to carry. Yet she drew herself up anyway, pride stiffening her spine as she told him she would manage, that she had always managed on her own, and that staying where one was not wanted was far more painful than starting over with nothing. And for a moment it seemed he might let her pass, might step aside and allow the inevitable, but instead he exhaled slowly, as though surrendering to a truth he had fought too long, and said that she had misunderstood, that he was not barring her from leaving because he owned her or pitied her, but because she was wrong to think she was alone in her rejection, because he too had been rejecting her from fear rather than lack of worth. And the words fell heavily between them, raw and unpolished. And Eleanor felt the sharp edge of them cut through her defenses, because no one had ever admitted fault to her without expectation of forgiveness, and she did not know how to respond except with silence that trembled. He moved away from the door then, not opening it, but no longer blocking her path, giving her the choice back while asking her to see the truth behind his actions. And in that fragile moment she understood that the house was not rejecting her so much as it was resisting change, and that Caleb's coldness had been armor forged from loss, not cruelty. And though her instincts screamed to leave before hope could betray her again, another quieter voice whispered that perhaps dawn did not always mean departure. Perhaps sometimes it marked the beginning of something unrecognizable but real, and she set her valise down slowly, the sound of it touching the floor echoing like a decision that could not be undone. And Caleb nodded once, not triumphant but relieved, as though he had narrowly avoided a mistake he would have regretted forever. And though nothing was resolved, though wounds still bled beneath the surface, something shifted that morning, something small and fragile and terrifying, because now they both knew the loneliness they carried was shared, and shared burdens, Eleanor had learned, were either lighter or twice as heavy. If this chapter moved you, if you believe in stories where pride and pain collide before healing begins, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable journeys like this one. The days that followed were different, not easier, but honest in a way Eleanor had never experienced before. And honesty, she discovered, could be just as exhausting as pretending, because now Caleb spoke when things troubled him instead of retreating into silence, and she, in turn, allowed herself to speak without cushioning every word in politeness, and they stumbled often, misunderstanding intentions, reopening old wounds neither had intended to expose. But with each argument came a strange relief, because anger meant engagement, and engagement meant she was no longer invisible, and slowly the ranch began to feel less like a place she was, trespassing in and more like ground she was learning to stand on. She learned the rhythms of Caleb's grief, the days when memories weighed heavier, the nights when sleep abandoned him, and he paced the porch as though walking could outrun sorrow. And instead of retreating, she began to sit with him, not demanding conversation, just presence. And it changed something fundamental between them, because grief, when witnessed without judgment, loses some of its power to isolate, and in return, Caleb began to notice Eleanor's quiet strength, the way she faced disappointment without theatrics, the resilience carved into her by years of being overlooked, and he realized with dawning guilt how close he had come to repeating the same harm the world had inflicted on her. The town noticed, too, the subtle shift, the way Eleanor walked with more confidence, the way Caleb's eyes followed her without suspicion, and whispers softened into cautious approval, because people could sense when something fragile was being carefully rebuilt, and though the past could not be erased, it no longer dictated every breath they took. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, Caleb finally spoke the words he had never allowed himself to form. admitting that he had sent for a mail-order bride not because he wanted a wife, but because he feared becoming a man so closed off he forgot how to feel. And Eleanor listened, not as an obligation, but as a woman who understood the terror of emotional survival, and she told him she had answered the advertisement not because she dreamed of romance, but because she dreamed of belonging somewhere, without having to earn the right to exist, and the honesty between them felt like standing in open air after years underground, frightening and exhilarating all at once, and in that moment, Eleanor realized she was no longer staying out of stubbornness or necessity, but because she wanted to see what might grow from the wreckage, if they both dared to tend it. If you're invested in this emotional transformation, make sure you subscribe, because stories of healing don't end, they evolve. The true test came when the past returned with sharp teeth and familiar voices, when Caleb's former life intruded in the form of relatives and expectations, doubts resurrected by those who believed a marriage born of desperation could never become one of choice. And Eleanor felt the old fear stir again. The fear of being dismissed as temporary, as replaceable. But this time she did not pack her valise, did not prepare herself for quiet retreat, because she had learned something powerful in the weeks since Dawn had nearly taken her away. She had learned that worth was not proven by endurance alone, and when confronted with questions about her place, she answered without apology, without shrinking, and Caleb stood beside her, visibly and unequivocally, not as a man guarding property, but as a man choosing partnership, and that choice changed everything, because rejection loses its sting when it is no longer internalized. That night, as they closed the ranch door together, Eleanor thought of the note she had once written, the certainty with which she had believed leaving was the only dignity she could claim, and she smiled softly at how wrong she had been, because dignity, she now understood, could also be found in staying, in demanding space, in allowing oneself to be seen fully and imperfectly. And when Caleb told her quietly that he was glad she had stayed, that he was glad she had not left at dawn, she did not answer immediately, because some truths deserved time to settle. But when she did speak, she told him she had not stayed because he stopped her, but because she finally believed she was not alone, and the ranch, once a symbol of isolation, became a testament to what could be rebuilt when fear was confronted rather than obeyed. If this ending resonated with you, if you want more stories of resilience, love, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because your support helps keep powerful stories like this alive.